Hello again, goobers. Welcome back to another art time-lapse video, or whatever I want to call these things. Um, it's been a while. Last time you probably heard from me was when I made my bone wrap video back in, October 2025. Yeah, so things did get a bit busy over the holiday season, and I have needed to focus on a bit more things outside of the work that I want to post on YouTube. But do not fret. I am working on a project right now and it should be coming out very, very soon. So stay tuned. It ended up being a lot longer of an animation project than my previous animations, about 7 to 8 minutes long, much longer than my 2 minute bone wrap animation that I worked on before. It's not going to be another song, unfortunately. I really appreciated the amount of love that I got on my bone wrap video. That made me really happy. But no, this is going to be a bit more of a mini lesson sort of thing with a bit of a silly twist to it. I'm just going to leave it at that. It will be coming out within the next week or so. The animation, the recording, all of that is pretty much done. I just need to do all the thumbnail art, the description, all that normal YouTube stuff. But yeah, it's gonna be something pretty different than the kind of content I've already been posting. Not much, obviously, but I hope you enjoy it. I worked really hard on it. But enough about that. Here I am drawing a picture of a skull with a portion of its cranium somewhat dissected off of the main body and leaving a bit of its brain exposed. I thought it'd be a nice way to practice my hand at medical illustration. I've always felt that I could never really draw a human skull quite right, and I've never been very good at drawing brains either. Brains are some of the hardest things to draw well for some reason, I don't even know. So, of course, I'm using a reference image of a skull facing 2/3 towards the observer. I think this angle is great for giving a general overview of all the main parts of the skull, while also giving plenty of space to include the brain as a focal point. And after drawing the base image that I wanted to create, I just started coloring in with a base color, this nice kind of tannish beige for the skull, and a little bit of like grayish lavender for the brain. I know the brain isn't actually pink in real life. It's much more gray, maybe even beige in some cases, rather than pink or purple. But I feel like because brains are so often portrayed as being like a pinkish purplish color in like, I don't know, outside media. I'm thinking of like Plants vs Zombies or something. That I would just I'm just gonna use the lavender as my base color for the brain because it looks fine and I can obviously change it later. So after putting in the base colors, I just went back through and colored in some of the darker portions of the skull, like the eye sockets, the nasal cavity, and also like the back of the cranium, or like the inner part of the cranium that would be in shadow. And then I started going through with a transparent white and a transparent black paintbrush to make some of the areas that should be shinier a bit brighter and some of the places that should be more shaded a bit darker. If you mark the same spot with the transparent black marker, you can make a very shaded area and add a little bit of a gradient going into the brighter areas. And the same thing goes with the brighter marker. You can streak in the same spot to make it shinier and more white. I attempted to add some spotty texturing to the mandible, the lower jaw there, to kind of give it a bit of more of a bony, rough texture, but I decided to kind of go over that and maybe come back to that kind of idea later, especially because I think it would be more important to add the general shading of the skull first before I decide to add some kind of texturing So I kind of went back through and added more darker shadows beneath things like the zygomatic arch, the sides of the maxilla, the upper and lower mandible to give it a bit more depth in the places where the bones of the skull likely curve inward or are more eclipsed by things like the teeth. I also decided to make the outlines of the general picture more transparent to give the overall picture a more realistic look. Of course, having the outlines there is good for understanding the space where I need to be adding color, adding shading, adding shiny spots, whatever. I wanted the final image to not have those hard outlines in the end, and for those outlines to be interpretable through the shading and the shiny bits and the color. So instead of using hard outlines, what I would do is I would go over the areas that I would want to add shadows with dark lines, and those dark lines would seep out into the white background a bit and make it look a bit too soft. So I would go over with an eraser and just shave off those bits, and it would give it this sharp outline design, especially along the bottom of the mandible. That wasn't like using these hard outlines that I drew in the beginning. It gave it a lot more of a realistic look. I added darker lines around the teeth to give it a bit of depth, to make the teeth look like they were more so embedded into the maxilla in the mandible. For this drawing, I imagined that the light source would be somewhere in the upper left, so a lot of the shinier bits would be the areas of the skull that are more so towards the upper left of those parts of the skull. And also, that helped me locate where I should make the darkest parts of the skull as well, especially in the upper part of the nasal cavity and the inner area below the upper portion of the skull. From here, it was a bit of trial and error. I would add some shading here and there, add some shiny bits here and there, and if anything didn't look quite right, I would undo that part. I would, reverse the effect I was trying to add to that part. There was quite a bit of uncertainty to my process, but at the same time, I was going by logic most of the time. When you would shade around the edges of the object, typically you would go with more darkness. You would have more shading because those are the parts that are going to be more obscured by the object in relationship to the light. And if you were going to have shinier bits, those would be the ones that are facing more towards the light. When you have parts that are supposed to be indented, you would want to add a little bit more darkness in those areas. Things like that. Once I had most of the general shading done with this part of the image, I would go a lot darker in some of the areas, like what I'm doing here with the eye sockets. I would go a lot darker to add more contrast between the darker and the lighter portions of the picture. Of course, whenever I go too dark, I can always add more light or add more of that beige tannish color to the darker areas to make it blend a little bit better with the rest of the image. When I got to the forehead region of the skull, this is something that needed a bit more logic to think about because the forehead is angled towards the light, so there should be a lot more shine in that area, but it's also along the edge of the skull, so I would want to add a little bit of shading there. So the way to compromise this is that I added a really thin shadow along the edge to give it that little bit of outline, and then a big shiny spot to make that forehead look nice and smooth. The main final touches left on this major area of the skull was just to add some shading to the edges created by the dissection. These areas would, for the most part, be pretty shaded because they're facing upward and sideways towards the pretty much the opposite side of where the light source would be. After I was finished with the shading in those areas, I added a bunch of little dots to give it some texture along those edges. Because when you think about a fractured bone, you're looking at the more spongier marrow within that bone. So it's going to have that more porous texture. After that, I just went through and touched up a bit of the other parts of the skull. There were just, small things that would bother me. I would go through and touch it up a little bit with some shading, with some shiny bits, just maybe adding a little bit more of the beige color to those areas. Just whatever didn't look quite right, I would try to remedy with a little bit of touching up. It was all really experimental. When it comes to the medium of Photoshop where you can just undo any stroke that you make, it's pretty easy to just experiment a lot with where you add things, where you subtract things, and nothing can really go wrong. So I think it's actually a really great medium for learning how to draw in general, but specifically in this case, in a more realistic style. So finally, I got pretty much finished with the general skull, and I was able to move on to the brain. And I started by just coloring in with more of that pinkish lavender color, and then just going through and shading all of those little folds all throughout the brain with a bit of a darker purple and a little bit of white to add a little bit of shine. I didn't want all those brain folds to become obscured as I added more color throughout the process, so I went through with a darker color to make sure that those folds look distinct from each other. And I used a lot of that transparent white on the areas of the folds that were facing towards the light source to give it a more shiny texture. Because, of course, the brain is very wet. And I really wanted to encapsulate that, but it was pretty difficult to. Like, I got the texture to look pretty shiny, but it was more of a metallic shiny rather than the kind of wet and soppy shiny I was looking for. So, fun fact, the folds in the brain are called sulci and gyri. The extruded folds that you see all over the brain, like the shinier bits here on my skull, or on my image, are called the gyri, and then the little indented lines between them, the darker bits, are the sulci. And similar to similar structures like the villi and the small intestine, the excessive folding helps to fit the larger surface area of the cerebral cortex within the confines of the quite small skull. The cerebral cortex is responsible for a crazy amount of things in your brain, such as memory, reasoning, movement. Like, if you ever heard of the idea of if you ever heard of the idea of a wrinklier brain being smarter, that's kind of where it comes from. If you have more wrinkles, that means you have more cerebral cortex overall, more surface area of cerebral cortex that your brain needs to fold all up like a paper ball inside of your skull. So I think that's pretty cool. But anyways, I started adding a bit of red texture to the lower area of the brain. It gives it a bit more color. I think it blends really nicely with the purple, and obviously a visceral organ is going to look more red, I would imagine, right? I emphasized a bit more of the shininess to make it look a bit more wet. I think I kind of got there at the end. And then to also exaggerate that kind of wet texture, I darkened the sulci, the indented folds in the brain, to kind of add more of that contrast. And then using similar principles, I added the cerebellum and a little bit of the brainstem near the lower back of the skull. which means I was finally able to move on to the last part of the drawing, the dissected portion of the skull. This part was pretty straightforward. I used a lot of the same principles that I used on the major portion of the skull. But of course, this part of the skull was a lot more smooth, it had a lot less features to it, so it was a bit easier to touch up and shine and shade. Just like the major portion of the skull, I gave this section the same kind of shaded edges and the same porous texture throughout. Based on the perspective, there's a lot more of that porous edge exposed on this part of the skull. From here, I gave it all of the shading and the shining and the smoothing that I kind of did with mainly the forehead texture of the major part of the skull. Looking back, I'm realizing that I completely forgot about the ears. The reference I was using was at an angle where it didn't really show the ear holes of the skull. They didn't really look very prominent, so I think it just slipped my mind completely. And if they were there, the one that would be visible in my drawing would be just below the zygoma and a little bit to the right of the mandible. It would almost be just along the dissection line. So we can just assume that we can't see the hole because the skull is opened up in this way. Like, yeah, I didn't forget. I would never forget something so obvious. Absolutely not. Because of the way that the skull is dissected in this picture, the zygoma is also kind of cut off near the end. So I added the little point on the dissected portion where it would have connected and kind of just fractured from there. I also added a kind of back area to that dissected portion to give it a bit more depth, and also because I imagined that it would have that back portion if it was pulled off in that kind of way. And from there, all I felt that was needed was a bit more shading on the brain, especially where it came in contact with the skull, to make it look like it was more so engulfed by that cranial area. And then I just went around and touched up a bit of everything, a little bit of shading all over the place on the major portion of the skull, the minor dissected portion of the skull, and also some of those brain folds as well. And with that, my skull drawing, my skull dissection drawing, whatever you want to call it, was complete.